Mr. Harrison Blackwell, a man whose fortune could buy entire city blocks without him feeling a dent in his wallet, had always found amusement in simplicity. In his youth, he was a self-made man who built an empire out of almost nothing, scratching his way up through persistence, intelligence, and an uncanny ability to sense opportunity. Now, many years later, he owned businesses in almost every sector: real estate, tech, fashion, even fine dining. But despite his considerable wealth and reputation, he had grown increasingly weary of the way people treated him only with reverence because they knew who he was. Politeness that felt rehearsed, kindness that felt bought. The truest side of a person, he often mused, could only be seen when they believed there was nothing to gain. It was a cool autumn morning when Mr. Blackwell decided to put his theory to the test. He was in the city visiting some of his properties when he passed by a restaurant he'd heard about, Le Bon Vie. The place was famous for its exclusivity, catering to celebrities, business moguls, and the city's wealthy elite. They claimed to serve the best dining experience for those who truly appreciated the finer things. Curious about how such an establishment would treat a man with nothing to offer but a few crumpled bills, he decided to pay them a visit. After returning to his hotel, he dressed himself in clothes he hadn't worn in decades: an old pair of faded jeans, a threadbare jacket, a faded cap, and shoes that, while still intact, had long lost their polish. He even smudged his hands with a bit of dirt, adding an air of wear and tear that hinted at hard times. He studied himself in the mirror, adjusting his hat to hide most of his face, and practiced slumping his shoulders just a bit. Satisfied with the transformation, he made his way back to Le Bon Vie. As he approached the restaurant, he felt a thrill he hadn't experienced in years. It was a kind of rush, a mix of excitement and apprehension that came with stepping into a world that was so different from the one he usually inhabited. But as soon as he stepped into the grand entrance of Le Bon Vie, his enthusiasm was met with a hard, unwelcoming gaze from the maitre d', a tall, slim man dressed impeccably in a black suit, his eyes cold and calculating. The maitre d' looked him up and down, the faintest curl of distaste forming on his lips. "Excuse me, sir," the maitre d' said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I believe you may have the wrong place." Mr. Blackwell lifted his head slightly, meeting the man's gaze. "No, I was hoping to have a meal here." The maitre d' raised an eyebrow, his mouth curving into a sneer. "Le Bon Vie is not a casual establishment. We cater to patrons who appreciate refinement." His gaze traveled over Mr. Blackwell's worn clothes. "Perhaps a different establishment would be more to your taste." Mr. Blackwell kept his voice calm, masking his irritation. "I'm just looking for a meal. I can pay." The maitre d' gave a slight chuckle, as if the notion amused him. "Yes, well, we have a dress code, sir, and I'm afraid you do not meet our standards." Before Mr. Blackwell could respond, another voice chimed in. "Is there a problem here, Jeffrey?" A man in his late 40s, sharply dressed and radiating authority, approached them. Mr. Blackwell recognized him from some social events. He was the restaurant manager, Mr. Lowell. Jeffrey, the maitre d', smirked and leaned in to whisper something to Mr. Lowell, but his voice was loud enough for Mr. Blackwell to catch fragments. "Doesn't belong here, can barely afford, charity case." Mr. Blackwell's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, keeping his gaze fixed on the two men. After a brief, smug exchange, Mr. Lowell turned to him, a mockingly sympathetic smile on his face. "Sir, perhaps Jeffrey hasn't explained," Mr. Lowell began smoothly. "Le Bon Vie prides itself on providing an exceptional experience. We cater to clientele who appreciate our standards. There's a diner just down the street that might be more appropriate for you." Mr. Blackwell tilted his head, as if considering their suggestion. "I understand you're exclusive, but surely you have room for one more. I just want to enjoy a nice meal." Mr. Lowell's expression turned hard, his voice clipped and cold. "We reserve the right to refuse service. Please don't make this difficult." With a nod, Mr. Blackwell took a step back. He'd seen enough. He muttered a quiet thank you and turned to leave, noting the way both men exchanged smug, self-satisfied looks as he walked out. His face remained impassive as he exited the restaurant, but beneath the surface he was seething. The treatment had gone beyond simple exclusion, it had been outright disdain, a judgment of his worth based purely on appearance. Once he was out of sight, he let out a low chuckle. If these men thought they could get away with treating people like this, they were sorely mistaken. He took a deep breath and looked back at the restaurant, the grand glass doors reflecting his own weathered disguise back at him. An idea had taken root in his mind, and it grew with each step he took away from Le Bon Vie. He returned to his hotel room, changed back into his usual attire, and picked up his phone. With a few quick calls, he reached his lawyer, Mr. Grayson, and his financial advisor, Ms. Locke, who both sounded intrigued but not surprised by his sudden interest in acquiring a high-end restaurant. They were used to Mr. Blackwell's unusual whims, but this time he could sense they were curious. Still, he didn't share his motivation. He would wait to see how things unfolded. Within the week, Ms. Locke had negotiated the purchase, and the ownership transfer was complete. La Bonne Vie was now his. He left explicit instructions to keep the transaction confidential from the staff for the time being. He wanted to watch them continue their routines, observe their behavior with unsuspecting guests. He needed to be sure that his experience wasn't a fluke, that this disdain for lesser patrons was truly ingrained in their treatment of anyone they deemed beneath their lofty standards. The next day he returned to La Bonne Vie, this time dressed as himself, though still inconspicuous in a dark coat and cap. He stayed outside, watching patrons come and go, observing the staff's behavior through the glass doors. He watched as well-dressed guests were greeted with flourishes, smiles, and deference, while anyone dressed modestly was met with curt professionalism at best, outright condescension at worst. In one instance, he saw an elderly man in modest attire turned away, much like he had been. It confirmed what he had suspected. This wasn't a one-time incident, it was the restaurant's culture. With his resolve hardening, he returned to his hotel and prepared himself. It was time to see this establishment from every angle, every nuance of disrespect they held. If this culture could be exposed in a single day's observation, there was far more to uncover beneath the surface. The thrill of an impending lesson, a shift in the tides, fueled his next steps as he prepared to watch the entire staff unknowingly reveal themselves. Over the next few days, Mr. Blackwell put his plan into motion, determined to fully understand the culture he had unknowingly bought into. Each day he disguised himself differently, carefully choosing personas that would allow him to slip through unnoticed, yet significant enough to experience the true nature of the restaurant's staff. Each disguise was meticulously crafted, worn, muted clothing that wouldn't raise suspicion, paired with subtle accessories that reflected a different backstory. On his first day back, he dressed as a retiree, wearing an old tweed jacket and flat cap, moving slowly, as if weighed down by age. He entered the restaurant at lunch, adopting a warm but humble demeanor, greeting the hostess with a gentle smile and requesting a table for one. She barely looked up, her eyes fixed on her reservation book as she muttered, "We're fully booked." "But the dining room looks half empty," he replied softly, gesturing toward the open tables scattered around the room. The hostess lifted her head, an eyebrow raised in irritation. "Those are reserved, sir," she replied with a tone that made it clear she wouldn't be making any exceptions. Her expression didn't soften, her posture didn't relax, and she made no effort to offer him any further assistance. "I understand," he replied, not wanting to press too hard. He turned to leave, feeling the sting of her dismissal but maintaining his composure. It was exactly what he'd expected, but seeing it firsthand, experiencing it in this disguise, brought a fresh sense of purpose to his plan. This wasn't merely a lack of customer service, it was a complete disregard for anyone they deemed unworthy. The following day, he returned in a different guise, this time as a middle-aged man in modest business attire, the kind of person who might come in during a lunch break for a quiet meal. He carried a worn leather briefcase, adjusted his tie, and made his way up to the maitre d', a different one this time, hoping that a change in staff might reveal different attitudes. But as he approached, he noticed the maitre d' giving him a quick once-over, eyes flicking dismissively over his attire. "Do you have a reservation?" the maitre d' asked, his tone professionally cool but edged with impatience. "No, I was hoping to just walk in," Mr. Blackwell replied, maintaining his polite demeanor. The maitre d' sighed, as though this was a colossal inconvenience. La Bonne Vie typically requires reservations, he said, stressing the name as if to emphasize its exclusivity. "But the tables aren't full," Mr. Blackwell noted, echoing his earlier observation. "I'd be happy to sit anywhere that's available." The maitre d' gave a tight smile, though it lacked any warmth. "I'm afraid we have to prioritize our regular patrons. We don't usually accommodate walk-ins without advance notice." There was again the familiar dismissal, the unspoken message that he didn't belong here. Mr. Blackwell offered a gracious nod and stepped away, watching as the maitre d' immediately turned his attention to a well-dressed couple entering behind him, their greeting marked by smiles and welcoming gestures that had been denied to him. After a few more days and repeated encounters with different members of the staff, Mr. Blackwell's observations solidified his understanding. The dismissive, elitist attitude was systemic. Whether he appeared as an elderly man, a modest businessman, or even a student trying to grab a quick bite, the reaction was always the same, a calculated coldness. an implied condescension that made it clear they didn't care to serve anyone they perceived as less than. In one particularly revealing encounter, Mr. Blackwell arrived dressed as a young art student, carrying a sketchbook and wearing a loose, oversized sweater and paint-splattered jeans. His demeanor was intentionally casual, as if he were there to soak in the restaurant's ambience more than its fine cuisine. He approached a server, a young woman whose expression immediately turned disapproving as she took in his appearance. "I just wanted to get something light," he said, showing his genuine interest with an enthusiastic smile. "Maybe a small soup or salad?" The server gave him a forced smile, her eyes flicking toward his outfit with thinly veiled distaste. "I'm not sure that would be appropriate," she replied curtly, crossing her arms. "We don't really serve light meals. Our dishes are designed for refined palates." Her response stung, but Mr. Blackwell kept his composure, nodding as if he understood. He could see the pride she took in her words, the satisfaction of subtly implying that he was unworthy of their food. It was an attitude he'd encountered often in his business dealings, the type of arrogance that hid behind a polite veneer, only revealing its true nature when confronted by someone deemed unworthy. By the end of his disguised visits, he'd collected enough evidence to confirm what he had suspected from the start. La Bonne Vie's staff wasn't just following a strict set of rules, they embodied a culture of elitism, one that actively sought to exclude those they deemed unfit. And it wasn't limited to one or two employees, it was woven into the fabric of the restaurant, from the way they greeted patrons to the way they spoke about their standards. Each night after his outings, he would return to his hotel room, jotting down notes in a small notebook, recording every condescending remark, every dismissive glance, every moment of thinly veiled superiority. It was a kind of catalog of arrogance, a study in how people behaved when they believed no one was watching, and he took careful note of each interaction, each instance where the staff's true colors bled through their polished facade. Finally, on his last day of reconnaissance, he decided to leave a small test, a hidden act of generosity, to see how the staff would react. Returning once again in his elderly man disguise, he quietly enjoyed a cup of tea, served begrudgingly by a young waiter who barely acknowledged him. When he finished, he left a generous tip, far more than the cost of his tea, and watched as the waiter pocketed the money with a smirk, muttering something to another staff member about charity cases. The lack of gratitude, the casual mockery, it all reinforced what Mr. Blackwell had seen throughout his visits. With every interaction, every smirk, every careless dismissal, his resolve solidified. This wasn't simply an opportunity to buy a business or make a statement. It was a chance to reshape the entire culture of La Bonne Vie, to turn it into a place where respect wasn't contingent on wealth, where every guest, regardless of appearance, was treated with dignity. His plan was now clear, and he could hardly wait to begin. In his mind, he envisioned the upcoming changes, the staff's reactions, the shock and surprise as they realized the true nature of their new boss. But first he would need a grand reveal, an event that would not only unmask him as the new owner, but expose the restaurant's flawed values to everyone in attendance. With that, he prepared to move into the next phase, setting in motion the plans that would transform La Bonne Vie and everyone who worked there, from the inside out. The day of the event had arrived and Mr. Blackwell was ready. He had arranged a charity dinner at La Bonne Vie, inviting an array of high-profile guests, philanthropists, community leaders, and influential business figures. The event was positioned as a fundraising gala for a local charity supporting underprivileged families, a cause that aligned well with the image Mr. Blackwell hoped to project for the restaurant under his ownership. His guest represented a blend of society's elite, but he had also discreetly invited a few individuals from modest backgrounds, hoping to contrast how they were treated compared to the usual clientele. Dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, Mr. Blackwell arrived early to observe the setup and watch the staff without yet revealing his identity as the new owner. The restaurant buzzed with preparation, and the staff were particularly tense, knowing that important guests would be arriving. Jeffrey, the maitre d', moved with an air of authority, instructing the waitstaff to ensure everything appeared flawless. Mr. Lowell, the manager, seemed equally on edge, pacing around and making minor adjustments to the decor, checking and rechecking the guest list with a rigid sense of control. As Mr. Blackwell observed from a discreet corner, he watched as the first guests began to arrive. The staff greeted them with well-practiced politeness, ushering them to their tables with smiles that, while seemingly genuine, carried an underlying tension. The staff knew they needed to impress tonight. Failure was not an option. Then, Mr. Blackwell's strategically selected guests began to arrive, those dressed simply, without the trappings of wealth or privilege. One of them was a schoolteacher named Miss Ramirez, a modest woman with an unassuming demeanor, dressed in a simple yet elegant outfit. She was one of the charity's beneficiaries, and Mr. Blackwell had arranged for her to attend, as a guest of honor to share her experiences. As she entered, Jeffrey's smile faltered, his eyes lingering on her attire before offering a lukewarm greeting. "Good evening, Mom," Geoffrey said with forced politeness. "Are you here for the charity event?" Miss Ramirez nodded, explaining she had been invited to speak. Jeffrey's expression tightened slightly, as if he doubted her words, but he led her to a seat at the back, far from the tables reserved for the elite. Mr. Blackwell watched the exchange with narrowed eyes, making a mental note of Jeffrey's dismissive behavior. Soon after, another guest arrived, a young man in his early 20s named Marcus, who worked as a local mechanic. Dressed in a clean but simple button-down shirt, Marcus approached the entrance nervously, clearly aware he didn't fit the usual profile of La Bonne Vie's clientele. Mr. Lowell intercepted him before he could reach Jeffrey, his tone bordering on patronizing. "I believe you may be at the wrong event," Mr. Lowell said, looking Marcus up and down. Marcus stammered, explaining that he had been personally invited. Mr. Lowell's smile was thin, his skepticism evident. "Of course," he replied, leading Marcus to a small, tucked-away table near the kitchen door, far from the main gathering. As more guests arrived, Mr. Blackwell noticed the stark contrast in treatment. Those dressed in designer attire, dripping with wealth, were escorted to prime tables with panoramic views of the city. Meanwhile, the modest guests, who represented the very cause the event was meant to support, were relegated to the outskirts, treated with thinly veiled impatience. Mr. Blackwell felt his anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. Tonight would be the night he would expose this hypocrisy. The event proceeded as planned, with drinks served and light conversation filling the air. Mr. Blackwell moved through the crowd, greeting guests warmly but observing the staff's interactions with a keen eye. Finally, as the dinner hour approached, he signaled for the main event to begin. He took the stage, standing before a crowd that included both the wealthy and those who had been subtly marginalized throughout the evening. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight," he began, his voice carrying a warmth that instantly commanded attention. "Tonight we gather not only to celebrate the fine dining and hospitality of La Bonne Vie, but also to support a cause close to my heart. This restaurant, under new ownership, is committed to becoming a place where everyone, regardless of background, status, or appearance, is treated with respect and dignity." A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. The staff exchanged bewildered glances, clearly shocked by his words. Mr. Lowell's face turned pale, and Jeffrey shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between the guests and Mr. Blackwell. "To some of you," Mr. Blackwell continued, "I may look familiar. Perhaps we've met, but under different circumstances." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Over the past few weeks, I have visited La Bonne Vie in various disguises. I came as a retiree, a modest businessman, a young student, and even as someone who might appear homeless. Each time I was met with disdain, coldness, and in some cases outright hostility." The room fell silent. Guests exchanged curious glances, while the staff looked increasingly uncomfortable. Mr. Lowell's mouth opened and closed, as if he wanted to interrupt but couldn't find the words. "Tonight I watched as some of you, who are here as representatives of our cause, were seated at the back, near the kitchen, while others were given prime seats," Mr. Blackwell continued, his gaze steady as it swept over the room. "This is not the culture I want in a place that now belongs to me." There was a collective gasp as the realization dawned on the staff and guests alike. Mr. Blackwell was the new owner. The man they had dismissed and treated as an inconvenience was now the one in control. Jeffrey and Mr. Lowell looked horrified, their faces drained of color. The guests were captivated, some of them exchanging whispers, while others simply stared, riveted by the unexpected turn of events. "Under my ownership," Mr. Blackwell went on, "La Bonne Vie will be restructured to reflect values of kindness, humility, and respect. No one who walks through these doors should ever feel unwelcome or beneath anyone else. Starting tomorrow, our staff will undergo training on hospitality that focuses not just on service, but on understanding and empathy." The staff's reactions varied. Some looked relieved, as if they, too, had grown tired of the toxic culture that permeated the restaurant. Others looked resentful, uncomfortable with the changes that would disrupt their perceived superiority. "As for those among you," Mr. Blackwell continued, turning his gaze directly toward Mr. Lowell and Jeffrey, "who have shown repeatedly that they cannot adhere to these values, there will be no place for you here. You are free to seek employment elsewhere." Jeffrey's face twisted with a mix of anger and humiliation, while Mr. Lowell's expression turned defiant, his pride clearly wounded. But they said nothing, aware that there was little they could do to argue against the very man who now held their livelihoods in his hands. Mr. Blackwell took a moment to let his words settle, looking around at his guests, ensuring they understood the gravity of what he was saying. He could feel the energy in the room shift, a mix of shock, respect, and anticipation for the new era he promised to bring to La Bonne Vie. To everyone who has supported this event and this cause, he concluded, "Thank you. This restaurant will not only serve as a place for fine dining, but as a place where everyone can come together, regardless of who they are or what they look like. I hope that together we can make La Bonne Vie a beacon of inclusivity in this city." The room erupted in applause, guests rising from their seats in admiration. The charity representatives, Mevs, Ramirez, and Marcus, looked moved, clearly touched by the speech and the commitment behind Mr. Blackwell's words. Even some of the staff, particularly the younger waiters who had long been uncomfortable with the restaurant's elitist attitude, joined in, clapping with renewed energy, their spirits lifted by the promise of change. As Mr. Blackwell stepped down from the stage, several guests approached him, offering their congratulations and expressing their support for his vision. He accepted their compliments graciously, but kept a keen eye on his departing staff, particularly Jeffrey and Mr. Lowell, who slinked out with dark expressions, clearly defeated. The night wound down with a sense of hope and excitement. La Bonne Vie had already begun its transformation, and Mr. Blackwell felt a deep satisfaction knowing that the restaurant would finally embody the values he had spent a lifetime cultivating. His plan was not yet complete, but tonight marked a crucial turning point, a foundation for the new La Bonne Vie, built on respect and genuine hospitality. As he watched the remaining guests enjoy their evening, mingling freely regardless of their backgrounds, Mr. Blackwell allowed himself a moment to savor the victory. This was only the beginning, but it was a start. He had set the wheels of change in motion, and he looked forward to seeing how his vision would shape not only the restaurant, but the lives of everyone who entered it. In the days that followed the charity event, Mr. Blackwell implemented sweeping changes at La Bonne Vie, beginning with an overhaul of the staff. Jeffrey, the sneering maitre d', and Mr. Lowell, the condescending manager, were both dismissed without ceremony. Their final, indignant glares as they exited the restaurant only confirmed to Mr. Blackwell that his decision had been right. Their arrogance and elitism were incompatible with the new culture he envisioned for La Bonne Vie. To fill the gaps left by their departure, he brought in a hospitality consultant, Miss Fletcher, whose experience spanned prestigious but welcoming establishments around the world. She was a warm, open-minded woman in her early 40s with a deep passion for genuine service and an ability to bring out the best in her staff. Together, she and Mr. Blackwell designed a comprehensive training program, focusing on empathy, attentiveness, and inclusivity. Every member of the staff, from the servers to the chefs, would participate, and those who were unwilling to adapt were invited to find opportunities elsewhere. Mr. Blackwell didn't intend to destroy La Bonne Vie's reputation as a luxury establishment. Instead, he wanted to transform it into a place that combined sophistication with a spirit of inclusiveness. The restaurant could maintain its high standards while also welcoming people from different walks of life. For the first time, La Bonne Vie would offer community events, family-friendly nights, and occasional pay-what-you-can dinners to support local charities. These changes were met with skepticism by some of the remaining staff, but Mr. Blackwell sensed their resistance softening as they watched his commitment to this new vision. The transformation began in earnest when Ms. Fletcher led the first training session. She started with the basics, covering respectful language, eye contact, and the art of listening. Some of the staff, especially the younger ones, were receptive, eager to learn and broaden their skills. Others, however, were slower to embrace the shift. A handful of servers who had enjoyed the air of exclusivity clung to their old habits, begrudgingly going through the training exercises without fully committing to the spirit of the new La Bonne Vie. Mr. Blackwell anticipated this resistance and decided to observe these holdouts more closely. One particular server, Paul, a man in his late 20s with a sharp tongue and a disdainful attitude, caught his attention. Paul had been with La Bonne Vie for years, growing accustomed to the high-paying tips and the praise from wealthy patrons who appreciated his aloof demeanor. Despite Ms. Fletcher's efforts, Paul frequently fell back into his old ways, giving curt responses to guests he deemed less worthy of his attention and maintaining an air of superiority that clashed with the restaurant's new mission. One evening, Mr. Blackwell decided to watch Paul in action. He observed from a corner of the restaurant as a young woman entered alone, dressed casually in a simple blouse and jeans. She approached the hostess stand with a warm smile, but Paul intercepted her before she could be seated, his expression barely concealing his contempt. "Do you have a reservation?" he asked, his tone clipped. The woman hesitated, caught off guard by his sharpness. "No, I was hoping to get a table for one. I've heard wonderful things about this place." Paul's mouth twitched in a smirk. "We're very busy tonight. La Bonne Vie typically requires reservations, especially on weekends." But there seemed to be a few open tables, she replied politely, gesturing to a section that had not yet filled up. Paul sighed, glancing at the tables as if he were doing her an immense favor. I suppose we could fit you in, he muttered. But please be aware that we don't offer modifications for special requests, and we're on a strict schedule tonight. The woman's face fell slightly, but she nodded, accepting his terms with grace. She took her seat, and Mr. Blackwell noted how Paul continued to serve her with minimal courtesy, rarely making eye contact and often brushing past her table with barely a glance. After the woman finished her meal and left, Mr. Blackwell approached Mems, Fletcher, and quietly pointed out Paul's behavior. They agreed that another private conversation was necessary. When the dining area had emptied, Mr. Blackwell invited Paul into his office. Paul, Mr. Blackwell began, his tone calm but firm. I've noticed you're having some difficulty adjusting to the changes we're making here. Paul shifted uncomfortably, but his expression remained defiant. With all due respect, Mr. Blackwell, I've worked here long enough to know what kind of clientele La Bonne Vie attracts. This isn't some neighborhood diner. People come here for an exclusive experience. Mr. Blackwell nodded slowly. You're right, people do come here for an experience. But exclusivity doesn't mean arrogance. Our guests deserve warmth and respect, no matter who they are or what they look like. Paul crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing. With all due respect, Mr. Blackwell, you're changing everything this place was built on. The reputation, the clientele. People want to feel special when they're here. They can feel special, Mr. Blackwell replied, without being made to feel that others are beneath them. If we can't provide that, then we don't deserve to be called a fine dining establishment. Kindness and luxury aren't mutually exclusive. Paul stared at him, a flicker of something like uncertainty crossing his face. Mr. Blackwell saw the hesitation and seized on it, offering Paul one last chance. I'm not asking you to abandon your standards, Paul. I'm asking you to broaden them, he said gently. I believe you can be an excellent server, but if you can't adapt, this may not be the right place for you. After a long pause, Paul finally nodded, though his expression remained conflicted. I understand, Mr. Blackwell, he said, his tone subdued. Over the following weeks, the restaurant's transformation began to take root. The once cold atmosphere started to warm, with staff members who had initially resisted the changes beginning to understand the value of Mr. Blackwell's vision. Miss Fletcher's training sessions continued, focusing on empathy exercises and scenarios designed to encourage understanding of guests from all backgrounds. She introduced role-playing exercises where staff members took turns acting as guests, experiencing firsthand the discomfort of being ignored or belittled. Slowly but surely, even Paul's attitude began to shift. Mr. Blackwell watched as he softened his approach, speaking more kindly to guests and showing genuine interest in their dining experience. While Paul was far from becoming the friendliest member of the staff, he was learning to treat every guest with the respect they deserved. One evening, an elderly couple entered the restaurant, dressed in simple clothes and looking a bit out of place amidst the chic decor. Paul, to Mr. Blackwell's surprise, was the first to greet them, guiding them to a comfortable table by the window. Throughout the evening, Mr. Blackwell watched as Paul engaged them in conversation, ensuring their meal was pleasant and accommodating their requests with care. The couple left with smiles, and Paul's demeanor, as he watched them go, held a hint of satisfaction Mr. Blackwell hadn't seen in him before. Seeing Paul's gradual change confirmed to Mr. Blackwell that his efforts were paying off. La Bonne Vie was becoming more than just an elite restaurant. It was transforming into a place where everyone, regardless of their social standing, could feel welcome. The final test came when Mr. Blackwell arranged another charity dinner, this time with a mix of patrons from different economic backgrounds. The staff, who had undergone weeks of training, performed admirably, greeting each guest with genuine warmth and attentiveness. There were no dismissive glances, no sneers, only smiles and a sense of unity among the staff as they served. By the end of the evening, guests mingled freely, wealthy patrons and charity beneficiaries sharing stories and laughter. It was exactly the kind of environment Mr. Blackwell had dreamed of, a place where people from all walks of life could come together and feel valued. As the night wound down, Mr. Blackwell stood at the back of the room, watching the scene with a deep sense of fulfillment. He had succeeded in transforming La Bonne Vie, not just as a business but as a symbol of inclusivity and respect. The once cold restaurant was now filled with warmth and kindness, a testament to the power of empathy and understanding. In that moment, he knew he had achieved more than he could have ever imagined when he first set foot in La Bonne Vie in his shabby disguise. He had built a legacy of respect, one that would endure long after he was gone, carried on by a team who now understood the true meaning of service. The evening of the grand reveal had arrived, and La Bonne Vie was nearly unrecognizable from the establishment it had been only weeks before. The once cold, detached atmosphere was now vibrant and inviting, filled with the sound of quiet laughter, warm conversation, and the clinking of glasses. The staff moved through the restaurant with a newfound ease, greeting guests with genuine smiles and offering personalized service that made each diner feel seen and valued. It was a remarkable transformation, and one that Mr. Blackwell felt deeply proud of as he prepared to take the stage once again. Tonight was not just any event, it was an official relaunch under the new mission he had crafted. To celebrate, he had invited not only affluent patrons but also local community leaders, small business owners, educators, and even some of the restaurant's former guests, who had once been dismissed or mistreated under the old regime. His guest list was deliberately inclusive, designed to highlight the changes La Bonne Vie had undergone. As the guests filled the restaurant, they were greeted by a beautifully decorated dining room, where the ambience was both luxurious and welcoming. Soft lights cast a golden glow over the tables, and gentle music played in the background, setting a sophisticated yet relaxed tone. The staff, dressed in sharp but approachable attire, moved gracefully among the tables, serving a new menu that reflected Mr. Blackwell's vision of accessible luxury fine cuisine without pretension. Mr. Blackwell took a moment to scan the room, watching with quiet satisfaction as guests from all walks of life enjoyed the same attentive service, regardless of their appearance or background. He spotted Paul, the once cynical server, now effortlessly engaging with a family seated near the back. Paul's transformation had been a pleasant surprise, and seeing him now, genuinely invested in his work, was one of the most rewarding outcomes of this entire journey. Finally, as the main courses were served, Mr. Blackwell made his way to the front of the room. The room quieted as guests turned their attention toward him, their faces filled with anticipation. Mr. Blackwell took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice carrying a warmth that instantly captured the room's attention. "Thank you all for joining us tonight. It's an honor to welcome you to the new La Bonne Vie." A round of applause filled the room, and Mr. Blackwell waited for it to settle before continuing. "As many of you know, this restaurant has undergone quite a transformation recently. When I first acquired La Bonne Vie, I had the privilege of seeing it through a different lens. I experienced firsthand how easily someone can be judged by their appearance or treated differently because of assumptions. It opened my eyes, and it solidified my resolve to make this place a symbol of something more meaningful." He paused, letting his words sink in, his gaze sweeping over the audience. "Tonight, I want to share the journey we've taken to make La Bonne Vie a place where everyone feels welcome, respected, and valued. Luxury and kindness can and should go hand in hand. We aim to provide a dining experience that honors every person who walks through these doors." The room was silent, captivated by his words. Mr. Blackwell took a moment to glance at his staff, many of whom were watching him with expressions of pride and gratitude. He continued, "None of this would have been possible without the commitment and hard work of our incredible team. They have embraced this new vision with open hearts, and I couldn't be prouder of the progress they've made. This place belongs as much to them as it does to me." He nodded toward Ms. Fletcher, who stood at the back, her eyes bright with pride. Her training and dedication had played a crucial role in the transformation, and Mr. Blackwell knew he couldn't have done it without her. "To our guests," he said, turning his attention back to the crowd, "we are here to serve you, no matter who you are, where you come from, or how much you earn. At La Bonne Vie, everyone is family. This is a place where warmth and respect are as important as the food on your plate." There was a pause, and then the room erupted in applause. Guests rose from their seats, clapping enthusiastically, some even wiping tears from their eyes. The applause went on for several moments, echoing through the restaurant and filling it with an overwhelming sense of unity. As the applause died down, Mr. Blackwell felt a surge of emotion. His mission had succeeded not only in transforming La Bonne Vie but in bringing people together, breaking down barriers that had once separated them. He stepped down from the stage, mingling with the guests, shaking hands and exchanging words of gratitude. As he moved through the crowd, he came across Ms. Ramirez, the school teacher who had been among the first to experience the old La Bonne Vie's condescension. She looked at him with a grateful smile, her eyes filled with admiration. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwell," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "What you've done here is remarkable. You've given people like me a place to feel special, and that means more than you know." Mr. Blackwell's heart swelled with pride. "Thank you, Ms. Ramirez. It was long overdue, and I'm just glad to see it come to life." As the evening progressed, Mr. Blackwell watched as guests from different backgrounds connected, sharing stories, laughter, and even exchanging contact information. It was exactly what he had envisioned, a space where social divisions melted away, replaced by genuine human connection. Toward the end of the night, Mr. Blackwell noticed Paul standing near the entrance, watching the scene with an expression of quiet contemplation. Mr. Blackwell approached him, sensing the significance of this moment. "Quite the night, isn't it?" Mr. Blackwell said, clapping Paul gently on the shoulder. Paul nodded, his gaze still fixed on the crowd. "It's incredible. I never thought I'd see something like this here. I guess I was wrong about a lot of things." Mr. Blackwell smiled, recognizing the humility in Paul's words. "Change isn't always easy, but you adapted, and that takes courage. You've done well, Paul?" Paul looked down, a hint of a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwell. I didn't understand at first, but now I get it. It's not just about the food or the atmosphere. It's about making people feel like they matter." Mr. Blackwell nodded. "Exactly. People will always remember how you make them feel, and that's the true mark of exceptional service." With a renewed sense of purpose, Paul returned to his duties, and Mr. Blackwell felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The journey had been challenging, and there had been moments of doubt, but seeing the changes reflected in both his staff and his guests reaffirmed everything he'd set out to accomplish. As the last of the guests departed, Mr. Blackwell remained behind, surveying the restaurant one final time. The staff gathered around him, their faces glowing with pride and gratitude. Ms. Fletcher stepped forward, offering him a warm smile. "You did it, Mr. Blackwell," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "You created something truly beautiful here." "We did it, Ms. Fletcher," he corrected her gently. "It was all of us together. Le Bon Vie is a testament to what happens when people open their hearts and see each other as equals." They exchanged a look of mutual respect, understanding that this journey had been about far more than a restaurant. It had been about breaking down prejudices, fostering kindness, and proving that wealth and compassion could coexist. As he left the restaurant that night, Mr. Blackwell felt a quiet contentment settle over him. Le Bon Vie would continue to thrive, not just as a high-end restaurant, but as a place that embodied the values he held dear. It was a legacy of kindness, respect, and empathy, a legacy he hoped would inspire others to follow. Walking through the empty streets, he reflected on the journey that had led him here. In a world that often valued appearance over substance, he had found a way to create something meaningful, something that would last. And in that quiet moment, with the lights of the city twinkling around him, Mr. Blackwell knew that he had not only changed Le Bon Vie, he had changed himself, and perhaps, just a little, he had changed the world. Months after the grand relaunch, Le Bon Vie had blossomed into a symbol of inclusivity and excellence in the city. Word of its unique approach spread quickly. It became known not only for its refined menu and impeccable ambience, but also for its commitment to treating every guest with warmth and respect. Patrons of all backgrounds found their way to the restaurant, drawn by both its reputation and the promise of an experience unlike any other. Mr. Blackwell had kept his presence at Le Bon Vie steady yet unobtrusive, often blending in as a silent observer, or helping out in minor roles, carefully noting how the staff interacted with guests. His subtle oversight ensured that the restaurant's values remained intact, that the culture he had painstakingly cultivated endured. It wasn't just the guests who noticed the change, employees felt it too. They now took pride in being part of something bigger than just a job, a place that treated people with genuine care. One afternoon, Mr. Blackwell received an email from a local magazine. They wanted to feature Le Bon Vie in an article about the city's most influential dining spots, specifically highlighting businesses that had positively impacted the community. Mr. Blackwell read the email with a small smile. Recognition had never been his goal, but he appreciated how Le Bon Vie's transformation was resonating beyond its walls. The magazine interview was scheduled a week later, and the day of the feature arrived with an air of excitement. A journalist and a photographer were seated at one of the best tables, ordering a variety of dishes to experience the full range of the restaurant's culinary offerings. They had requested an interview with Mr. Blackwell, wanting to hear firsthand about the philosophy that had driven Le Bon Vie's success. As he sat with the journalist, he shared his journey, carefully describing the initial inspiration, his own experiences of witnessing the staff's behavior before the transformation, and the challenges they'd overcome along the way. He emphasized the value of empathy in business, the importance of community, and how Le Bon Vie had been built on these principles. The journalist listened intently, scribbling notes and occasionally glancing up with an expression of admiration. "It's rare," she remarked, "to hear of a luxury restaurant that cares about everyone who walks through the doors. Most places thrive on exclusivity. What made you take this approach?" Mr. Blackwell paused thoughtfully. "Exclusivity has its place," he replied, "but I believe true luxury isn't about who you keep out, it's about making every guest feel welcome." Le Bon Vie's transformation was about creating a space where people are valued for who they are, not what they have. The world needs more of that. The journalist nodded, clearly moved by his words, and they continued their conversation, exploring the nuances of Le Bon Vie's journey. At one point, the photographer captured an image of Mr. Blackwell standing near the restaurant's entrance, a quiet pride evident in his stance. After the interview, the article was published with the title Redefining Luxury: How Le Bon Vie Became a Place of True Welcome. The feature attracted even more guests, and soon Le Bon Vie found itself busier than ever. Reservations filled weeks in advance, and the restaurant became a landmark for visitors, a place that locals recommended not just for its food, but for the values it represented. However, as Le Bon Vie's popularity soared, challenges inevitably arose. With the influx of guests came higher expectations, and it was up to the staff to ensure that the values Mr. Blackwell had instilled remained consistent. It wasn't always easy. Some patrons occasionally grew impatient with wait times or demanded exclusive attention, forgetting the ethos of the place. For these situations, Mess Fletcher continued to play a key role, gently reminding the staff of their training and reinforcing the restaurant's commitment to kindness and respect. One evening, a high-profile client arrived, visibly frustrated by the wait and irritated by what he considered a lack of exclusive treatment. He was a well-known businessman in the city, and as he sat down, he made his expectations clear to Paul, who had become one of the restaurant's lead servers. The man insisted on special attention, loudly reminding Paul of his status and connections. Paul, with the patience and professionalism he had acquired, listened to the man's requests without reacting, handling the situation with calm assurance. At one point, the businessman muttered something about Le Bon Vie losing its edge by catering to just anyone. Mr. Blackwell, seated nearby, overheard the remark and watched Paul's response with interest. Paul took a deep breath, met the man's gaze, and spoke with respectful firmness. "Sir," he said, his voice steady, "at Le Bon Vie, we strive to make everyone feel welcome. Our priority is to ensure that each guest has a memorable experience, and we treat all our guests with the same respect, regardless of their background." The businessman blinked, surprised by the directness in Paul's tone. There was a pause as the weight of Paul's words settled over the table. A flicker of irritation crossed the businessman's face, but he seemed to understand that this wasn't the place for special treatment, at least not in the way he'd expected. Mr. Blackwell felt a swell of pride as he observed Paul's composure. It was a testament to how far the restaurant and Paul himself had come. Not long ago, Paul had been the type to favor high-profile clients, prioritizing them over those he saw as less important. But now, Paul embodied the very values Mr. Blackwell had fought to instill in the restaurant's culture. Later that night, as the staff cleaned up after closing, Mr. Blackwell gathered them for a brief meeting. He thanked them for their continued dedication, for upholding the principles that had made Le Bon Vie a success. The staff listened attentively, their faces reflecting both pride and gratitude. They had come to see Mr. Blackwell not only as an employer but as a mentor who had shown them the importance of kindness, resilience, and integrity. As the months passed, Le Bon Vie continued to thrive, its reputation as a beacon of inclusivity drawing guests from all over. Each day, Mr. Blackwell walked through the restaurant, greeting familiar faces and welcoming new ones, his heart full as he watched his vision unfold. One evening, a young woman approached him after her meal, a soft smile on her face. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice filled with emotion. "I've never felt so welcome at a place like this. It's rare." Mr. Blackwell smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. "Thank you for being here," he replied. "That's what Le Bon Vie is meant to be, a place for everyone." The woman nodded, her gratitude evident, and as she walked away, Mr. Blackwell knew that every challenge, every obstacle, had been worth it. In the end, Le Bon Vie had become far more than a restaurant. It was a living testament to the power of empathy, a place where the walls separating people from each other could be broken down, if only for a meal. The legacy Mr. Blackwell had built was no longer just his. It belonged to everyone who walked through its doors, to every guest and every staff member who believed in its mission. Standing at the entrance as the night drew to a close, Mr. Blackwell looked out over the dining room, his heart full. Le Bon Vie was more than he had ever hoped it would be, a place of true welcome, a place where luxury and kindness coexisted in perfect harmony. And as he turned off the lights and locked the doors, he knew that its spirit would endure, continuing to inspire everyone who crossed its threshold, no matter who they were or where they came from.